Thank you everyone for joining us. This is a Liberia event online. I'm excited to be hosting George Makari and Zia Haider Rahman, who will be discussing George's recent book of Fear in Strangers. I wish to offer Zia the first question.
Great, thanks, Lloyd. Thanks. Well, Georgia, it's great finally to speak face to face. You know how I feel about this book. It's fantastic, and I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to read it so early. And yeah, it's fantastically well written, if I may say so. I think it's a bit. I sound a bit pompous when I feel I sound pompous when I say that a book's well written, but I feel that's the prerogative of novelists. They can opine the quality of the writing, and it really is excellently written. But I'm gonna start with the obvious question, and you can tell us, please, if you could, why was this question of interest to you? And the question being, xenophobia, what is it?
Yeah.
About?
Well, honestly, I wandered into the subject, and I realized that, in fact, wandering and discovery was one of the ways of structuring the book, because in fact, I didn't come to this through some kind of rational process of elimination. I started having finished a book on the nature of mind and the way it emerged and helped create secular culture. And as a psychiatrist, I was very interested in the question of how we misknow each other, the other mind problem, or the, less, kind of UFO-y, are we robots, other mind problem. And so, it's pretty highfalutin stuff, philosophy and psychology. And I had come to London to give book talks, and I was hearing about a Turkish invasion when I was in the sweater shop, and I didn't understand what was happening. My friends told me this Brexit thing was happening, and that would definitely not pass. I told them not to worry, Donald Trump would definitely not win. And then I went to meet with my agent, who said, "So what's next?" Well, I think it's a cruel question, frankly. I hope that no one asks me it right now, because it's kind of like you collapse at the top of a mountain and people say, "So what's next?" But I knew she was going to ask, and she's a wonderful agent. And I started to think, what is next? And when I came home, this word xenophobia was everywhere. And I thought, maybe this is like the political and social downstream effect of some of those philosophical and psychological problems that I'm interested in. And so I started to dive in. And then, the third leg in the stool emerges, which is, hey, by the way, buddy, you're the son of immigrants. This kind of writerly conscience where I said, unlike my other books, you cannot disappear. You have to tell your own story. And that's part of this story. So now I had, these three legs of the stool. One is, I'm a historian. I want to go deep and find out where this thing came from. I'm a citizen, and I'm worried about what's happening around me in my nation and in nations across the world. And I have a personal history of being immigrants. Those become the three legs in the stool of the book, and it was my challenge to kind of integrate them into one story.
Right, yes. So it was prompted by the events of 2016. I mean, that was the, I think that caught us all by surprise, and you touch on that in the book as well. You address 2016 and the upheavals and the xenophobia that suddenly took hold in so first initially in Britain and then in America. I say took hold then, but of course there were indications of it already elsewhere, notably India. But I'm gonna go straight into the heart of it. I have questions for you, and I feel I can be a bit selfish here as well, and because I have the microphone. To what extent did your training as a psychiatrist and your psychiatric bent, to what extent was that relevant in your interest in this, and in the way you thought about it when you were writing it. I mean, the book, let me just say, the book draws on many different disciplines, including literature. I mean, you bring up Tolstoy, Mark Twain, all the greats, but you, of course, also draw on other disciplines: sociology, philosophy, psychiatry, pseudo-psychiatry, all the sort of human intellectual endeavors that have some relationship with this topic. But I want to know about your sort of how psychiatry has been relevant to you in your thinking about these things.
So I would say, I kind of wear two hats. One is as an intellectual historian, the other as a psychiatrist. The first half of the book is really the intellectual historian hat. And that was really about a comfort in this rather difficult task, if I might say so, which is how do you tell the story of a word? How do you tell the story of a term and embody it in people and in context and in social movements? I've already struggled with those problems because, when you write the history of schizophrenia, you try to do something like that. The second part of the book, it was really, I think, deeply helpful that I had thought long and hard about what are the compelling paradigms for understanding psychology and sociology. And that was in part my psychiatric training at work, right? Because I had to winnow through a jungle of different writers, because after the Holocaust, a lot of people tried to figure out what the heck causes this thing. And so I had to be confident that I could really make claims about the central paradigms and leave out of the book or put in the footnotes those things that were not central. And that was a real challenge and took, frankly, a good deal of confidence that I understood the lay of the land. And some of that really came from being a psychiatrist and psychiatric training.
Mm. I was very struck by, I didn't know very much about the word xenophobia, and I was very struck by its origins and how it did this kind of 180-degree switch.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. And also by how so many people didn't even understand that switch had taken place, or didn't understand the ironies.
Right.
They weren't aware of, even people, as you point out, people of goodwill, actually, as well.
Yeah.
So that originally it was used to describe, sort of shocking now, but originally it was used to describe the response of Africans, South Asians, Native Americans, of colonized people, their reaction to the treatment meted out to them, the treatment or the anticipated treatment for good reason meted out to them by colonizers.
Yeah.
That it was a way. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I think that would be fascinating to
Look,
hear.
At first, when I was interested in the book, I thought this is beyond my realm of expertise, because everyone said the book goes back to antiquity, and I'm not a classicist and I don't know ancient Greek. And so the first kind of moment where my mind exploded was when that turned out to be completely untrue, and that in fact xenophobia cannot be found. And I try to suggest why. It is a non sequitur, it is a nonsense kind of compound to put these two things together, given their meanings in antiquity. So that was the first time my mind exploded. And then I was like, okay, well, I got to find it. And it turned out to be a relatively modern term from the late 19th century. It had a couple of minor uses, one in psychiatry, which made me feel at home, but that died almost immediately as a phobia, and one as a kind of notion of ultranationalism, also a very minor meaning that was, basically dead. And then, the second time my mind exploded, I'm writing the history of this like extraordinarily important ethical principle. And what happens? It becomes popularized in a weaponized racist manner to describe inferior, primitive peoples who have not, because of their own inferiority, their racial inferiority, have not risen to the level of civilization where they don't have the utter equation of strangers or enemies. What does this mean? It starts with the Boxers in China. It means all these people who are rejecting our colonizing force our power, our demands, has nothing to do with us. It has to do with their internal racial fear of strangers, totally irrational, of course. So this is the way it spreads to all the colonies and all the metropoles. And suddenly the books, the dictionary has this word, everyone knows it. And so this was, of course, terribly shocking to me and surprising. And then, as you say, it gets ironized, and both liberals and socialists start to push back based on their tenets of belief. The liberals, toleration; the socialists, the brotherhood of man that extends beyond race. And the critical third part is starting to be the collapse of racial science. So as racial science starts to collapse, and these people say, hey, if this is so clearly about inferior races, how come my next door neighbor in the East End is like that? Or how come the people that I know in Mississippi are like that? Or, and they start to see this irony emerge that PS emerged for anti-Semitism, which was a positive term when it was first used, imperialism, civilizing mission from the French. So there are these Orwellian usages that then flip upon themselves, and it ends up being where the critique of a self-critique, a way for us to think about, are we bigoted against? And frequently it was the colonized immigrants. So these same people who had been invaded start to flow back to the colonies, and they become objects of fear and bigotry and xenophobia. So the whole thing takes this fabulous kind of 180-degree turn that, doesn't really fully win the war of ideas until after the Holocaust. But with the genocide in Congo, it becomes much more apparent that this is the case. And with the Brothers League in London and the KKK, and you start to have building momentum that this is actually a term we need to use, not in a racial way, but to police ourselves.
I was struck by the idea, with the benefit of your book, I was struck by the idea that original, how do we describe it? That original failure to recognize the obvious staring you in the face, that could be accounted for by something that you describe in the book that came much later, namely projection.
Yeah.
Actually, not so much later, but came later. If you could talk a bit about that projection, because it seems to be an idea that survives your scrutiny. Is that right? Would you say that and it provides a very helpful way of thinking, certainly for me, helpful way of thinking about what I've always known, which is that racism, xenophobia, these things always seem to say something about the racist. In fact, much more about the racist than the object of the racism. And that they seem to be destructive of the xenophobe. If you could talk about that, the idea of projection that has a currency already, but in relation to this topic, that would be great. And you see, by the way, why that perhaps in that an original usage of xenophobe, there was this kind of strange kind of projection that meant they could not see what they were doing.
And look, some people are onto this very early, and it's one of the reasons why I think xenophobia is an important term to differentiate from racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, etc. All of those names are names of the victimized group, and they don't say anything about the internal workings of the victimizer. There was a Harvard philosopher who, in 1909, said, we talk in America about the black peril, the yellow peril. What about the white peril? And Richard Wright picked up on this. He said, the way that we call these things implicitly suggests the problem really is with the Jews. It's really with the blacks. That's the name of the problem, right? And so xenophobia reverses that direction and says, actually, some of these people, and sociology shows this, aren't specific haters of blacks or Jews or Muslims. they're happy to hate a bunch of them.
Mm.
And so we have to think about the commonality inside the victimizer, while of course maintaining the discourse about these victimized groups, which is super important. I'm not suggesting it's not, but I'm suggesting it's half of the equation, and the other half really cries out for more robust theoretical understanding. Xenophobia, I argue, when at the end of the day, is a complex beast. It's three-headed. It has to do with fragility of identity. It has to do with fear and aggression. And it has to do with groups and fragility in groups. And if we think about one of those things, we're probably missing a couple things. So I want us to get more complex in the way we think about this phenomenon. Now, in the problem of identity, one of the most powerful paradigms was stereotypes. You just passively take them in from your culture. Yeah. And that's an easier problem, because stereotypes, if it's through a process of absorption, it should be amenable to re-education. We in America teach our kids about the concentration camps. We teach our kids about slavery. They should be able to unlearn stereotypes. But there is a deeper identity problem that you're referring to that has to do with a specific kind of projection. The idea of projection is very old. It usually meant I project that you're like me, and it's a projection of similarity. Yeah. But Freud puts forward this other notion of projection that I think has been, pretty powerfully empirically validated, that says actually sometimes people defend themselves against their shame and their guilt and project it outward, so you're exactly everything they detest in themselves. So you are precisely what they are not. And those people, they don't want to change their stereotypes. They don't want to go to unconscious bias training. They don't want to watch the movie where the minority is the hero. Those people are committed to a kind of hatred because it stabilizes their internal being. It stabilizes them, and it purifies them in a way. When you meet people who have this kind of level of projection, there are three kind of telltale signs. They live in a Manichaean world. So it is, that's bad and I'm good. They have no ambivalence. There's no like, well, maybe. No, it's absolutely clear and certain. And affectively, they're completely resolved. This is something that doesn't appeal to their empathy. So those are all stickier, more difficult problems that we have to encounter with the kind of xenophobia that's really deeply embedded in projection. So I argue like there are different levels of this stuff. We can modify some of these stuff. And then, there's this kind of more troubling problem. And if we don't distinguish it, we won't actually be able to think critically about how we're going to modify that. In America, it's really these subcultures of shame that have come up with the idea of white superiority as white supremacy as a kind of model for managing, I think, a whole bunch of social and political factors that has put them under a great deal of pressure.
Well, let's segue from pressures and social pressures to something that I wondered about in your book, and your book touches on so many things, and it's so tantalizing. It reminds me of my sort of rule of thumb of, how can you tell a nonfiction book is a great book? Well, one rule of thumb is you want to read it again, but another one is you want to follow up all the notes at the back. You want to read some of the references. And there are so many great stories in this book. I didn't know about Roger Casement. Oh, yeah. For instance, there are so many, so many. I've read Fanon, but I didn't know heck of a lot about him. So there are lots of things that I want to follow up. The question that arose in my mind about, you talk a little bit at the end about the causes of 2016, the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump. And it obviously confounded a lot of the thinkers who, published reams and reams of explanation, having failed completely to anticipate it. And one of the things that, certainly the left clung to was that this was the xenophobia was a reaction to an economic reaction.
Yes.
Either a reaction to 2008 or a reaction to 30 years of seeing no shift in real incomes.
Yeah.
But as you point out, that doesn't really fit with the data.
Right.
There are lots of instances of eruption of xenophobia in economically much better conditions.
Yeah.
And it really, that fact alone really presents some problems. There are some of the thinkers in the book who point to socialism, the existentialists that you look at, and others who point to a classless society as being one that would somehow substantially cure this tendency to xenophobia.
Yeah.
But I got the impression that was something you didn't set much store in. Is that right? What are your thoughts about that?
So I believe that's a 4-part question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's more just an invitation to talk about.
And I took some notes. I'm gonna. So the first thing I want to say is, when you mentioned Roger Casement, look, I think a bunch of folks knew about a couple of those people, but what I wanted to show was that, and because I think it's vivifying and it's ennobling and it allows us to, it's encouraging. There is a tradition, and these people knew about the tradition and saw themselves in the tradition of standing up against their own country's biases, not against anyone else's, but their own. And this goes back to Las Casas in New Spain. And, Roger Casement comes to meet Joseph Conrad, and he says after he meets him, that's the new Las Casas.
Yes.
And Lemkin coins the term genocide after most of his family has been killed. And he creates a lineage of thinkers that start with Las Casas. And so these are people who we have to remember, and they're not perfect people. They're all imperfect. They all have flaws that are, you can highlight. I prefer to highlight the fact that they saw and tried to act, and often with great bravery, acted against the tide of hatred in their own country. So I think I really felt that, at first I thought, I'm not going to impose this on the history, but then I thought, no, they're referring to these people. They're taking stock of their own actions and being encouraged by, the thing that St. Montaigne said or St. Paul said, and they. So I thought that was important to say. Now, I think there are two opposing models to xenophobia, to go to the economic question. There is the economic question, and there's the cultural invasion question, right? These are the two arguments that say it's not phobic. It has nothing to do with a phobia. It is rational economic actors who are being flooded with workers who then rather naturally want to defend their income. And so that rational actor, economic actor argument is a serious one. The problem is it mostly doesn't hold up. When you look at where xenophobia occurs, there is no wage depression. There is no change in economic standard of living. And in fact, one of the strange things is it often happens in areas where there are very, very few of these strangers. Yeah. So if you look at the alternative for Germany, where did it start? It started in these very rural places in East Germany, former East Germany, where there were no Syrians. They weren't there. So it couldn't possibly be and as you say, there are many economic downturns. 2008, I think, did put pressure on people. I think it's probably a partial factor because feeling helpless and getting paranoid are connected, right? There is a helplessness factor, but it doesn't explain why very many economic downturns do not result in xenophobia. So I wanted to say that, and the cultural invasion argument, look at the numbers of people in the cultural invasion. You know, when France felt culturally invaded by the Jews, there were an astonishingly few number of Jews in France during the Dreyfus case. So, you know, these were symbolic ultimately. And that's where I start to say, when you see that, when you do the fair analysis and say it's not economic, it's not cultural invasion, that's where you land in xenophobia. And that's where you have to start taking into account psychological and social factors. Now, the last part of your question is important. The Sartre and a whole bunch of folks, there are really two models for how you think about solving this problem utterly and completely. I'm a little skeptical about both of them because I'm not sure that we can solve the problem utterly and completely. But the liberal model is toleration, right? And it is basically that everything, you know, this is the paradox of toleration. You have to tolerate everything except for those who would destroy toleration. So that's the one, you know, exemption you have, but everything else you're supposed to tolerate. And for Sartre and the socialists, it was, this stuff is all side kind of displacement of economic disparity. And when we have a classless society, this stuff will go away. This is kind of like a displaced rage about class structure. And, you know, I don't think we have a classless society. I've never seen one before. So, you know, I'm skeptical that both have ultimate solution, but those are the only two that you find pitched at the political level, not at the psychosocial level.
What do you think of, thank you for that. What do you think of another possible contender for a cause? Namely, you know, we tend to disparage the great man theory of history, but you talk about charisma or prestige as being a key property, or as some thinkers have identified as a key property of the authoritarian who galvanizes or who marshals xenophobia in his, and I do mean his service. Is it, I mean, is that a possibility that actually what we're seeing when we see these eruptions of xenophobia is the fortuitous confluence of, yes, things that the masses bring, but also the appearance of some kind of demagogue who innately or by cunning is able to, you know, who has that charisma that you talk about, and who's able to see how to use xenophobia.
You know, historians hate your question because in fact, it's not like that is not the way you're supposed to think. And yet I do think that there is that factor. You know, look, I think the ground was prepared and you see the ground being prepared, I think, after the collapse of the Cold War in a lot of places where ultranationalists start to emerge, because there's no longer identity that is part of one of these first world countries. But the ground being prepared, it can be prepared for 50 years. It can be unprepared after it's prepared. And so, you know, historians never really like to, it's hard to factor that in, but I think it's inevitable that there is a group phenomenon that is quantum almost, right? That where a mass of people who aren't particularly united around anyone, but have a lot of maybe similar structural, both sociological, psychological, political contexts, can come together or not come together based on a very powerful, charismatic leader. And you know, one of the things that that's unfortunate is that social psychology is a very, very difficult field to do empirical research, and it's just really, really hard to do research on groups. But you know, I think I watched it happen in our nation, where you know, I think it's quite clear that without the one leader who emerged, there would have been a bankrupt Republican Party that had lied a lot and that had backed itself into corners, cold warriors without a Cold War, fiscal conservatives stuck with libertarians, and there was a collapsing structure of their ideology. But you know, could you have predicted that a TV con man would galvanize everybody, a community? And you know, and the community doesn't go away. I mean, that the recent elections in Germany were reassuring in one way. You know, the AFD only got whatever they got, 11% or whatever it was. But I think that analysts are saying that 11% is not going away. It's going to be there now. This is a community that has emerged. They see each other as common,
Yes.
in the way the Le Pen community has emerged. And they could grow or shrink, but they're going to be there.
Yeah.
So I do think that there's a galvanizing force for a grandiose leader who helps people say, you have no reason to be ashamed. We're great. We never lose. We're always right. And they suck.
Yeah. And there's and one could make the argument that the internet provided a way for such a person, or such people actually, to bypass the established modes that themselves had over decades since the Holocaust, you know, established themselves so as to prevent such a person from doing what he would do, you know, create
that's a very interesting point, because, you know, one of the things that I was struck by was some of the parallels between the moment when xenophobia actually went viral and our moment today, because both of them were moments about 20 years after massive globalization.
Yes.
Very asymmetric massive globalization, where power was, you know, I said, call it globalization at the end of a gun for the late 19th century.
Yeah.
Driven by new technologies that people still really hadn't mastered. And, you know, this amazing moment where I discovered the guy who coined the term xenophobia and found this picture, you know, of him with these telephonic things on his head. He's a stenographer. And I just love that picture so much, but it says at the nexus of a communication system that is just emerging. And so we are too. And so I think it's you know, it's really critical for people to start to think hard about what is happening to us. Look, I'm having a Zoom book talk with you in London with a bunch of people who I can't see. It is an utterly different world that we've been coming to, but now we're really in, especially after March 14th of the COVID pandemic.
So I don't know where we are for time, but I do want to make sure we do two things. One is talk a little bit more about what can be done. Yeah. And I also want to get you to read, if I may, from your book. What can we do?
Right.
At one point in your book, you lament the uselessness of, and you talked about it already, of diversity training, but also of education generally.
Wait. So look, this is what I think it's actually very, very important, but I think we have to distinguish the easier problem from the harder problem. Look, I just say that they're essentially, let's get more refined in our use of language. You know, part of this is this book was an attempt to, or in an Orwellian way, clarify our language. And I say there's this thing, it used to be called xenophobia. I'm going to call it other anxiety.
Yeah,
and
no, you are very clear about these distinctions in the book. I just put my sort of pop afternoon daytime television hat on for a moment. I don't know why, but just insight.
Yeah, right. So that part has to do with, I start with, you know, basically being human. Like, I don't know exactly what you're thinking. You don't know exactly, we can't. So that's a little bit of anxiety. We have dialogue, we have communication, we get through that. And then if you have some trauma and you have fight or flight reactions in front of strange people, we know how to make that better. You integrate people. But behaviorists call it habituation and exposure. You know, have them play on the same teams, have them go to the same schools. They will get over it. It works. Stereotypes. We know that undermining stereotypes and unconscious bias training also works. These are things that work. I don't want to be pessimistic about them. They work for that problem. What I start to say is, let's distinguish that from the harder problem. And I'm going to call that true xenophobia. I call it overt xenophobia. And that's the harder problem of projection-based desire to hate, not these passive ways of finding it. And for those, unconscious bias training does not work. Undermining stereotypes, you know, it helps a little bit, but it doesn't do the whole trick. And so for those folks, we have to think about deeper solutions. We have to think about, you know, how these subcultures of shame emerge, how we undermine them and correct them. And, you know, there are different people with different answers. Adorno had an answer, which is very it's not a quick fix. It says it goes back to the family structure, and you need less authoritarian families because authoritarian parents create both masochistically submissive kids who identify with authoritarians and find some displaced other to hate.
Yeah,
so
children of bullies bully.
Yep, that's right. If you're being bullied, you end up admiring bullies and bullying someone else. Yeah. And so this is a kind of projection of your own weakness onto the other. There are a bunch of other models. The third one, really, other anxiety, overt xenophobia. The third one has become very controversial in the United States. I think it's rather silly. It's really just a structural analysis. It is, what we're calling critical race theory in America is really just about institutions, customs, laws in which unfair outcomes have been baked into the system. And we need to relook at those and reconsider how we can make those more equitable. So I say those are three different things. They have three different kinds of, the three different diagnoses, if you will, with three different kinds of therapeutic, models. And if we lump them all together, we're going to get super confused and get mad at each other. There'll be straw man argument. There'll be all sorts of nonsense instead of good people all trying to do as best as we can with all of these problems.
Do you think that there's a place for education about xenophobia in schools? I mean, is this something that we should be talking about a lot more? I mean, I'm partly prompted by your mention of critical race theory, but also, reading your book, there's something I feel, in the sense of enlightenment, I feel enlightened by a book like this. I feel like I've gone into the history and I've understood that, you mentioned the word, that there were people, there were good people who understood that this was wrong at the time. Yeah. So the idea that this is, a modern fad is not tenable. It's not a modern fad. There were great thinkers back then throughout the centuries who understood that this was wrong and made those arguments very well. But what defeated those arguments was economic interest or political power, quite often economic interest, in fact.
Yes.
So it seems, that you're a historian, you're an intellectual historian, and it, it strikes me that the intellectual history of this, in something like the book that you've obviously, refashioned for schools, this sort of education, and an education in the history of this idea of how people wrestled with it.
Yes.
It seems to me that actually could do a great service in making, there's a great service to be had in making the idea of xenophobia an object itself, it's an object of study and normalizing it in that way. So that it isn't at the moment, it's a word and an idea, and its associated words are all things that strike terror into the hearts of everyone, not but to make it something that we can say, this is what it is, and help people recognize it when they see it.
Yeah, look, I want to move it from a term of opprobrium to a term where we all more deeply inquire. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I try to set out some of the questions. And I would, of course, be deeply, deeply gratified if this became something that people study more. Look, I'm giving a lot of talks at universities in the next phase of this. And it's interesting because I'm talking to people who study, in some cases, that it will be a community that studies anti-Semitism. In some cases, it'll be a community that studies racism. And, there was this one quote from Frantz Fanon that I found like both unbelievably depressing and, and critical. He's a Black man from Martinique. He gets assigned to go to Algeria as a psychiatrist. And he writes this sentence that says what he's learned: the French hate the Jews, who hate the Arabs, who hate the Blacks. And, he stops there, but you could see how you could just make the circle keep going. We've got to disrupt that. We, of course, need groups that study a particular kind of hatred. But I'm finding it very gratifying that I'm being asked to come and talk to groups that have focused on the one thing, but are really interested in hearing about how this concept might be a kind of skeleton key for a bunch of those things.
Yeah.
You know, when Adorno did this study funded by the American Jewish Council, because they had just seen what happened in Nazi Germany, they were looking for anti-Semitism, but the category kind of collapsed on them because they realized the guy who's anti-Semitic also is racist and also is authoritarian and ultranationalist. And so they started to have to shift categories to authoritarianism rather than the victim group. So I think there's a lot to be said about pivoting from the victim group, not look, the victim groups need to be protected. They need to be named. They need to be honored. And you know, that civil kind of ethical agenda is critical. But we need to pivot to also think about what the heck, as this guy said in 1909, what's up with the white folks, you know, in America? And what he meant was, like, we've got to think about the sources of hatred, not just the victims. And I hope that this book makes that case. I try very hard.
No, it does. Yeah,
I think that is the case.
I think it does, and I think also, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'm going to, but you might or might not want to agree. I think it's very useful right now for people who are engaged in anti-discrimination of one form or another, to recognize that they're each a part of something broader, something more expansive in the human condition, and that and by recognizing that, they can, they can form a union. You are absolutely right. Everybody needs to tell their own story, and they need to do that for themselves as much as in the service of, combating racism, but or gender hostility, whatever it is. But there is also, I think, a fracturing that's been unhelpful, and forming alliances is important, especially at a time when xenophobia is on the rise.
Exactly. So, if we can't ally with the folks in Hungary who have a particular animus against a particular group because the group doesn't ring very familiar, or in India, or in the Middle East, well, what have we done? We've just obscured a commonality that might really be important.
Exactly.
And that doesn't mean that experts in those domains don't have a lot to teach us about the historical specificity of why this group in India or why this group in Hungary, but that can be alongside of, and what can we think about in terms of the three-headed monster: identity, fragility, fear and rage, and group phenomenon. How can we use these three tools to try to maybe get to more of an understanding of what's going on in the group that is doing a lot of the hating?
Right, fantastic. George, would you mind reading to us?
I would love to read to you. Thank you, Zia. Thank you for those wonderful questions. So I finished this book, and the book has a framing narrator, which is me, because I told the story of my family's immigration to the United States. And then I finished the book when I was in a rural village in France where my wife grew up, where we would go in the summers. It's a village right near the Spanish border. It's a village filled with refugees and the families of refugees. Many of them had fled Franco and had come and settled in this village just across the Spanish border. I finished this book, and I thought, there's this thing I've been meaning to do for a long time, and I want to do it now. And that is to try to take the mountain trail that first the Spanish fled Franco from, and then Jews and others fled the Nazis from, going the other way. This mountain trail is very close to our house. And one of my heroes, Walter Benjamin, took this mountain trail and famously was captured at the Spanish border, interned in a hotel, and committed suicide. On that last walk for Walter Benjamin, he was carrying a small attaché case. Wasn't actually that small, and people told him, you have to leave this behind you. You know, he was having trouble breathing, and he said, what's in this attaché case is actually a manuscript, and it's more important than my life. So that's where this last end of the book sums up. The story of Walter Benjamin's flight is famous, and it has long haunted me. Did this brilliant wanderer, this European flaneur, know that in the end he would become mythic as a man on the run, a Xenos turned away, crushed by cool legalisms enforced at foreign ports and borders? In his final despair, did he know his story would be rewritten backward, so that the hike that his hike would become this hike would become a tourist destination, and his spirit would forever linger in dingy Portbou? And what of his briefcase? What was in it? Many have speculated, but I think the simplest answer is hope. That leather bag contained Walter Benjamin's last appeal. It was what remained of a trembling, failing trust that perhaps his voice might vault over the highest walls of hatred to reach far off, perhaps quite foreign beings who might join with him over those pages. Sometimes I imagine that if one stumbled upon that dusty valise and pried it open, as in the 1001 Nights, it would release the roaring voices of history's refugees and exiles, all their lamentations, their laughter, and their stories, all their accusations and confessions, all freed from oblivion together in a waterfall of sounds so grand, so sublime, that for an instant it would stop everything, even time. History is a trip into the spirit world. It is an attempt to wake the graveyard and give our ancestors voice and form so that we can confront them and free ourselves from their spells. History at its best then carries the hope not only of resurrection, but of exorcism. It holds the desire that by remembering, we will not repeat. Of fear and strangers has been my attempt to remember for myself, for you. Xenophobia is not some antiquated classical term. It is our word. We have a name for what is happening to us, what is growing in scope, flashing red, spreading. The only questions are, how extreme will it become? What forms will it take? Who will it target? And who will stand to oppose it? This hatred will not end of its own accord. This is our catastrophe. That poet who once grilled me about my history, himself descended from enslaved people, wrote that, quote, nightmare begins responsibility. That responsibility, I know now, to ourselves, to each other, is not just to wake up, but to remember it all when we do.
Georgia, it's also really accessible, and I think that's really important. It's important to highlight that. This is the sort of topic that can be dealt with at a level of abstraction and you know, a sort of up your own arse kind of way, but it wouldn't do as much good.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Look, I thought that, first of all, I had to accept the fact that this was a book that was going to break a lot of rules, that the structure was going to have to come from the set of problems that I faced, and not, for instance, my identity as an intellectual historian. I break a lot of rules about that. You know, you're not supposed to write about yourself. You're not supposed to mix the things that I mix. The silos that we have, I think, are for a phenomenon like this counterproductive. And, you know, it also makes it, you know, pretty rich to consider these interdisciplinary connections, because people aren't allowed to consider them. So, you know, what I say is, like, the behaviorists and the cognitivists and the psychoanalysts and the phenomenologists, like, they all live in their discursive bubbles, but actually they're all just part of the same problem. And if we think of it that way, as partial solutions, not, you know, necessarily all resolvable, it's additive. allows us to think more richly about these things. And so I'm sure that the people who live in those worlds are not particularly happy with that effort. But, you know, another thing is I've always been committed to the notion that history allows you to be as scholarly as you possibly can be. And if you write really, really, really well, and I don't know if I do, but I try, you should be able to communicate with anybody.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's not physics, it's not mathematics.
Yeah.
You should be able to. So I try to hold myself to that standard, and I don't know how well I succeed, but
Oh, you did. It's fantastic. It really is, and you should win prizes. And I'm really glad to hear that you'll be talking at universities and elsewhere, I hope too, because
yeah.
It does deserve a very wide audience.
I think I have 20 events in the next 6 weeks, so pray for me if you pray.
George, I do have a question. They're asking if you can offer guidance on how we would suggest tackling xenophobia, say in our daily lives. Like, what kind of conversations? How would we broach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, you know, when you think about it on a spectrum, let's start with the simplest part of the spectrum. We all have unconscious biases. We all know that being alerted to them, if we're not defensive and we're not one of those people who need to have someone to hate, we need to be tolerant of those errors. We need to understand that we make them ourselves. You know, I think that the cancel culture that we've had in the United States does not allow for human error and the fact that all of us have unconscious biases. So at that level, we can all interrogate, like when I'm under pressure, when I start to get a little bit paranoid, because, you know, as a psychiatrist, we have paranoia with a big P, that's an illness, and with a small p, that's just a part of human psychology. When we start to get a little paranoid, what do we do? Who do we go to? We all do it. That part we all do. We can all do better on that. And, you know, I think at that level, there's something we all can do every day, which is to be essentially feel like it is part of the project of being, you know, a better citizen, a better neighbor, a better husband, wife, father, mother, to encounter these, you know, these specters that actually we demean a little to feel better about ourselves. That's different from the project of what do you do about a whole community that is committed to violence and bigotry against a minority group. That is beyond the scope of an individual in their home. That has to be collective action. That has to be, you know, action that is targeted towards the underlying causes of that. And that's where we have to use our voices to advocate for leaders who are willing to, you know, be brave about those things.
It's interesting that you mention cancel culture. I sense the presence of cancel culture even in this conversation, actually. I say even, I think you can detect it always now in many conversations. There's a sort of fear of putting one's foot wrong, especially when you're talking about something as explosive, as potentially explosive as this, you know.
Yeah.
It's, I'm thinking of it because, you know, if someone came to me and said, you know, someone who thought that they'd been inconsiderate or that the workplace needed to do better about, you know, racism or sexism, and said to me, you know, what can we do to make things better? My first instinct is to say, well, actually, you've already started doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's and I fear that there's you might or might not know I was a signatory to the infamous Harper's letter, and
okay.
My anxiety, and I wouldn't have signed it, however, if it had included the phrase cancel culture, because I'm not quite sure what exactly that refers to.
Yeah, exactly. Fair enough. I wish I hadn't used the term.
No, I know. But inevitably, 9 out of 10 people who use it, you know, I agree. It's problematic the moment you say it. But there is this. There is this kind of damping of open conversation about in the pursuit, good faith conversation. And that I think is dangerous, especially on this topic, because so many people just don't know.
Yeah,
And,
well, look, let me go a little deep on this. Any idea, I've come to believe, that doesn't at some point meet its counter is ripe for extremism.
Yeah.
Every kind of claim that we have, ethically, morally, at some point probably has a limit. Yeah. And if you don't believe in that limit, it's very dangerous. Yeah. There are limits to free speech. Yeah. Right? There are limits to equality. There are limits to these things, even though they're wonderful virtues. So I would say, like, I don't like these terms like PC and cancel culture, because, as you say, so much can be smuggled into it, and they're being used as political football. Yeah. But if by PC you mean not saying derogatory things to African Americans on campus, I'm down with PC. But if by PC you mean if someone makes a slip and says something that's often then says, "Oh, I'm so ashamed of myself, I shouldn't have said that," and you want to somehow shame this person. Look, I got a great question. I did an event at Harvard yesterday, and someone said, you make a big deal about this guy Bartholomew de las Casas. You make him sound out like a great guy. He owned slaves and he had a plantation. So why do you think he's so great? And I said, you know what? Thank you for that question. It's worse than that, actually. He went to the Americas. He opened up a plantation. They weren't exactly slaves, but they were mostly slaves. They were just like, and he did all that. And what happened to this man? He had a crisis of conscience. He gave up the slaves. He gave up the plantation. He took orders as a Dominican. He went back to Europe. And 6 years later, he started to advocate in the most fearless way during the Inquisition for all of that. And not only that, in the third person, he talks about himself as a brutal, uncaring being. And he said, and these people were dying. And what did Las Casas do? He did nothing. He's writing about himself. It is an act of great moral courage in the Inquisition to write against what the Spanish Empire is doing. And he goes on and on and on in that vein. To me, that looks like a human being. Yes. That's not a saint. He actually, I don't know if he is sanctified, but that's a human being. And that's
not a secular saint. Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, that's a very good story. That is exactly the danger that progressives are running into right now, that they're not able to separate the good from the bad in terms of ideas. They can't. They don't seem to. The people they want at the top have to be saints, and none of us.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's right for a very, very small portion of at least in the United States, and I worry about the equivalence, of left extremism and right extremism. There was a study that showed that 420 professors have had problems with, this kind of like policing of speech on campus. We had 70 million people vote for Donald Trump. Yeah. The scale of the problem is not equivalent. No, and it is also true that radicalization on one side will lead to radicalization on the other. So I am concerned about, free speech, and concerned about I'm mostly concerned about how it will fragment the opposition to an authoritarian uprising on the right in this country. Yeah. That's what I'm worried about. That actually, I think, is more dangerous as a symbolic thing that delegitimizes people who are supposed to be in favor of toleration.
That's exactly my fear as well. Yeah, I'm a democratic socialist. Yeah, no, my fear is exactly that. All right, Lloyd, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Yeah, thank you for such a rich discussion. I'm sorry to say we have come to the end. George, thank you. Zia, thank you. Everyone else for joining us this evening or whatever time it is. Thank you.